I don't know if you'll be able to hear me because there's just like so much music going on, like so much music. I honestly thought people were exaggerating when they were like, oh, Nashville's like a musician's town, you know, like there's gonna be live music everywhere. It's a freaking Thursday afternoon. There's like 8 live musicians all playing. So before we get into it, I want to set some definitions. For me, world building, as most people know it, is like the pre-writing for a story or a screenplay that involves figuring out your setting's history, politics, magic system for fantasy writers. And I've noticed that a lot of writers, especially aspiring writers on the internet, are super into world building as an activity. They're super into world building because they think it's necessary. So just the other day, I was reading a question from a young writer who was like, hey, so I write all these big dramatic moments in my novel, but how do I write these smaller, more intimate moments? And someone's advice, as is often the case with a lot of these writing questions, someone's advice was to write a wiki of their story's world and the backstory for their characters in order to write these small, intimate moments. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's necessary, and I think that a lot of world building is really a waste of time. I'm gonna tell you why. I'm a big believer in letting stories flow naturally out of you, right? So for all of my reading about different authors and in my experience as a writer, Stephen King, Natalie Goldberg, Ray Bradbury, so many others, they describe writing stories as almost like an unconscious thing. They sit down, they put their pencil to paper, they put their fingers to the keyboard, and they just let the story come out of them. And then on a second draft or on a third draft, they make it coherent, they make it consistent, they build out the world a little bit. But they do that on the second or third or fourth draft. They don't do that on the first draft. They don't prepare for book by writing these huge, like 3-month, 300-page tomes about like every backstory of every single character who appears in the background of one of their scenes. They don't do that. What they do is they focus on the story, and then they build the world both in that process and afterward. When you're hemming and hawing about what the rules of your setting are, it is a form of procrastination that keeps you from actually writing the story. So a lot of the questions I see are things like, what political system should my sci-fi setting have? Should I use a hard or a soft magic system? Like, how much backstory should my character include? How much history of the setting should I write? And those are all like fine and good questions, but ultimately those are questions that don't have anything to do with your story. I've seen and heard of writers who've spent months perfecting their setting, but never actually putting out a story set in that setting. So there was one writer I had heard of who actually built a practice story world to write stories in so that he wouldn't ruin his real story world. And that's just such a silly idea. It's all made up, it's all practice. To spend time building a practice sandbox instead of just writing stories and getting better at your craft is, I think, the definition of procrastination or resistance. It's the definition of putting off the risk of actually writing a bad story because you're too afraid to actually fall on your face or write something clunky. My point is more that world building isn't storytelling, and storytelling is why most of us chose to become writers in the first place. Anyone who's taken a boring history class and read a really good novel know the difference between good world building and good storytelling. We know the difference between a history and a story. Story ultimately is about change, a change in a person's life or in a group of people's lives. When you take the focus away from those characters or from that idea, from that story, then what you end up doing ultimately is spending your time on stuff that isn't vital to the heart of your story. If you're not innovating the conflict, if you're spending more of your energy on the historical setting or the political system of your story and not on the characters or the plot or the problem, whatever it is you're trying to figure out or say through this story, then I think your energy might be misspent. And that's my point. Every piece of speculative fiction begins with speculation, and for a lot of us, including me, that's really the fun part of writing a story, is asking, well, what if? What if you lived in a world where all the sheep are super intelligent and they actually run the world economy or something? I don't know. But that's the fun part, and to that I say, yes, go for it, do it. Let's keep asking what if. Problem is when we get stuck doing that without actually getting to the telling of the tale. So if a lot of world building before you write your story isn't the way to go, then what is? For me, I think world building is best when it's during the drafting of your story. So let's say one of your characters goes to a coffee shop and you write this really vivid, strong, like sensory description of what it's like to be in this coffee shop. You can copy paste that description and put it in your world building doc or your story Bible or whatever and save it for later. Maybe your character goes back to that location. You know, let's say your antagonist in the middle of your drafting, you're drafting dialogue or some story, and she reveals something about herself that really informs her character. Then you want to take that, you record it, you set it aside, and you go, okay, I'm going to do something with that later, right? And it works in reverse too. It works during the editing process. Let's say you have a description of something that seems kind of flat and a little lifeless. What you do is you just go back and you rewrite it. You give it bones. You make it real for you, and it'll make it real for your reader. You can even journal it out. If you're writing something that doesn't quite feel right, you can just do a journal entry about it. Just try to describe it, inhabit it. But you're doing that while you're drafting your story. You're not doing it preparing for your story. You're not doing it before you've even begun the novel. You're doing it as you go. And to me, that's the fun of writing. That's the really rewarding part of writing, is creating something, and as you're creating, you're discovering new things about your setting, your things about your characters. There's no replacement for that feeling. And I think that's why they front load their writing project with so much world building, is because that really is the fun part. Discovering where your characters live, who they are, where they go, and setting an environment they live in. But when you front load your novel or your short story or your script with all of that information, you end up not being able to discover much during your actual writing of the story. In my experience, it ends up making the rest of your writing kind of boring and stiff because you're sort of constrained by all of this information that you put down in your story Bible. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but for me, I've found that if you create all the fun stuff before you've started writing the story, then it becomes harder to write the story. It becomes harder to sit down and do the hard work of creating it, because you've already done all the fun stuff. You've eaten your dessert already. There's less living in the moment. There's less writing that's vital and present. You're kind of just rewriting something that you already covered. If you find yourself getting stuck on your story, or you feel like you have to write this super detailed backstory for a character who appears for 2 scenes, let me be the first person to tell you, you don't have to. Just write it, and then write the backstory in as you go. That's okay. That is totally fine. Just go write the thing. And listen, if this approach doesn't seem fun to you or it doesn't work for you, then don't worry about it. It's okay. Like, everyone has their own different process. I think there is something to be said, though, for the fact that as speculative fiction writers, we tend to put off the actual writing as much as possible. And in a lot of ways, we use work and good excuses in order to do that. My video about reading writing books is kind of under that same umbrella, where we kind of just spend all our time learning about something instead of just living in it and working it. World building is kind of like that. We spend so much time building our Lego world of wonder and amazingness, and we don't actually get around to creating a story in that world. That's why I think world building for a lot of writers can be a liability. Even though it's a lot of fun, even though it's really great, I think if your end goal is to put something out there, then we need to limit our world building and kind of force ourselves to build our world as we write. Because that puts world building in its proper place, in service to the story. Ultimately, how you write is up to you, so if you disagree with me or if you have a different approach on world building, leave it in the comments and let me know how you do it. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Go ahead and give a like to this video, subscribe if you want more tips and advice and thoughts on the writing life. If you want access to my exclusive content, check out my Patreon, it'll be linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Alright, see you later.